Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Futures versus Foresight panel discussion. For this panel, we know that the future is unpredictable, yet each day, fashion companies use foresight to build scenarios and strategies that can lead them to preferred futures. In the conversation today, we will be unpacking the strategies that fashion can craft in order to take action towards their preferred futures. I will be your moderator for the session today, and my name is Sakai Funda. I'm joined in conversation by Maria, who is Director of Fashion and Beauty at Google Cloud, as well as Kerry Murphy, who is the founder of The Fabricant, which is a digital fashion house. And to get into it, we know that there are a range of possible futures and that the future can be actively shaped by every single decision that we take today. Prospering in the future, as we are discussing throughout the summit, means embracing uncertainty while simultaneously using divergent thinking. So these are various perspectives and approaches in combination with other objectives to meet our task. Now, this is quite the ask, and I'll start by reaching out to you, Maria, at a high level to start. To what extent can this strategic foresight complement the sustainability strategy in the fashion industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think the type of approach that you outlined, embracing uncertainty, but having a clear goal in mind, it's incredibly relevant for any complex topic or challenge, but particularly for sustainability, where it's really nuanced and there's not one clear solution. And it also honestly touches so many parts of an organization. Solutions, I truly believe, will necessitate pulling together new and different ways of thinking and perspectives, whether it be from biochemistry to fashion, to really find those innovative solutions.
Thank you, Maria. And I think, Carrie, coming from a digital fashion house, when we have these conversations and we talk about sustainability, we typically talk about it within the context of physical fashion. Coming from a digital fashion house, why now? Why are you looking to be a part of this conversation at this moment?
Well, one of the main motivations since the beginning for us has been sustainability. And we spoke about it a lot in the beginning as well, because it is a dire need for the fashion industry. When we started back in 2016 doing research, we found out that everybody's struggling and everybody has the same type of struggles, and they're really trying to create the change. The intention is there and the passion is there to change. However, how the system has been built, it is very hard to change within the current framework. So that's why we found it that it's actually increasingly important to try and do things in a different way. And in the beginning, we were talking about sustainability a lot. It was one of our key value propositions. We actually found out that people, even though they believe in it and their intentions are there, it doesn't excite them. It does not create action. It doesn't make people angry. It doesn't really lead them to take proper steps in creating proper change. That's really needed right now. So we wanted to take a different approach now, and it's like stop talking about sustainability and actually start creating something completely different, which is going more from the emotional side, which is to inspire the world to look at the problem in a different way, and to start thinking of like what are the other avenues that we could take, rather than really just like trying to do textile innovation, try to do better recycling, try to do all of these different things, that's part of the physical fashion industry. That's fully relevant, absolutely. However, the true form of sustainability for us is to actually reduce the amount of physical clothing created in the world. And how are we going to reduce the amount of physical clothing? How are we going to get people to buy less and get brands to produce less? When the business model is so focused on growth, and for a fashion brand to grow, they need to produce more. And regardless of the sustainable materials they're using, they're still producing more. So our ideology is really focused on, okay, let's make a digital experience that's better than the physical experience and get people excited about digital fashion. So they're actually going to consume less physical fashion. And I'm not saying completely replace physical fashion. I'm just saying how can we add value with digital and reduce the amount of physical? And that's the way we're going to make things more sustainable. So that's our driving goal right now, simply because I don't think it's moving fast enough. Well, that's what it feels like. Even though there's a lot of, even though the intention is there, it just feels like it's very, very difficult to move.
Thank you, Carrie. I think the same to you, Maria, having these new voices and perspectives. And we've talked about the importance of divergent thinking in crafting these strategies. What is your big motivation for being a part of this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think, listen, I care deeply about sustainability. Like I think many of us here today do. The UN's recent report for me was a real reminder about how quickly we need to take action to avoid irreversible climate change. But I think honestly, also from a personal point of view, I'm a mom. I have 3 small kids, and I think about, what kind of future, what kind of planet am I leaving to them? Are we leaving to them? And is that fair? So that's why it's really important to me. And I think, why is this conversation and conversations that are being had today so important? I think it's because action is absolutely fundamental and really important. But I also truly believe that conversations like these, as we talk about divergent thinking and changing perspectives, I think they help shape like what is actually the right strategy that we should be taking to actually make action. What kind of connections can we put together that you might not have thought of in the past? And so I think dialogues like these are really important to stimulate new ideas. Because again, I don't think there's one obvious solution. Otherwise, it would have been way too easy to take action some time ago.
Great. So you've both talked about, Maria, you talked about how important these conversations are and connected it to your personal motivation. And Carrie, when you're sharing your motivation, talking about taking a different approach. And Maria, I want to come back to you about what do you think the main issue is in just establishing this balance between the sustainability strategy and the growth strategy, which is part of the conversation that we're having today. What do you believe that main issue is?
Yeah, so I think like taking a step back, I think that if a company is thinking about long-term growth, it goes hand in hand with having a sustainable strategy. I truly believe that. Why? I think first of all, I would say that consumers do care, and they increasingly care about sustainability. And at Google, we've seen this within our search data that the number of searches of people who are looking for sustainable topics have increased exponentially over the past years, and definitely for Generation Z, but we've actually seen it across all age groups, which is really inspiring. And increasingly, we're also seeing there's been this idea of this gap between people being interested and sort of caring and making purchasing decisions. We've done some research where we actually have seen that is starting to close, particularly within the fashion industry. I also think that if you look at new circular business models, such as, that's what's spurring growth, whether, Carrie, it's digital fashion or it's pre-loved or it's upcycling, or even just taking your products back to stores and getting them redone. I think that's becoming mainstream, which again, I think goes hand in hand with a company's long-term growth. Lastly, I think for companies, in addition for it being like the right thing to do to invest in sustainable practices, I think what's really interesting is that it's also a win-win for companies. We at Google Cloud work a lot with companies thinking about how do you rationalize your supply chains to use less fabric, to make sure the right products go into the stores, to minimize fleet as you're shipping items around. And that makes sense absolutely from an environmental point of view, but it also makes sense from a business point of view from a cost basis. So I think they go hand in hand, Sakai.
Lovely, thank you. Carrie, I see you reacting there. And I'm wanting to know in what ways is your position similar or different to Maria's, because she touched on some elements about caring and that connection to the story around sustainability and the sustainability agenda, which you talked about earlier. So in what ways would you say that your position on the main issue here is different or similar to Maria?
Well, I'll echo Maria. I mean, of course, those are all the things that the physical fashion industry needs to establish. But I'll come back to my point and just to add value into that, which is the fact that, you know, for a company to grow, they need to produce more. And I'm a true believer in that sense that if we're capable of introducing a digital business model, which will allow companies to keep their profit margins intact, if actually not grow their profit margins through digital only fashion activations, similar to what we're seeing Balenciaga doing right now, Gucci and some other brands who are really kind of stepping into the metaverse conversation. They're starting to see traction with the younger kids. And of course, younger kids are the digital natives who are starting to see value in digital assets themselves. So I think for any brand, and I'll really speak from a brand perspective, this is not truly what we're doing at the Fabricant. I think the next logical step for a brand is to start thinking about the digital first approach. How do you get consumers to interact with your clothing from a digital first touch point, like e-commerce? E-commerce is, you know, super boring right now. It's flat, it's not colorful, it's not interactive. So how can we make it interactive? How can we so-called gamify it? It's not my favorite word, but it's like how can we allow people to interact with the clothing before they actually make a purchasing decision? Because essentially what fashion is, it's an emotional connection to an item, you know? So we already want to establish that emotional connection before they make the physical purchase. So they actually will have utility. So if you buy digital clothing, that you can play it in a game, that you can show it off on social media, that you can have an AR wearable. So you're already, you know, being able to interact with it. And once you bought that digital version, then you can redeem the physical version in the store, or it can be shipped to you. I think that's what most brands are looking at right now, simply because they understand that our lives are becoming so much more digital. And I think that will help us move more towards the production on demand model, that we only produce what we purchase. So once that purchase is done, the brand actually goes and produces the clothing and sends it. So that's the way we're going to solve overstock. That's where we're going to solve dead stock and simply reduce the amount of items that are there. You know, again, just echoing Maria on everything that she said, that absolutely needs to be there. But I think business model innovation is something that's really going to contribute to sustainability as much as all the, let's say, the sustainable materials, supply chain, and so on. But those are difficult issues. Like we very specifically say that we never want to be physical, because it's such a complex problem to solve with that full supply chain. And I've seen it with gaming companies where we're working with, where we're creating the digital items. And they're like, yeah, now we want to take these digital items and we want to create physical merch for our fans. And I'm like, I'll happily consult, but I will not take part. And then weeks later, they come back and they're like, oh, yeah, it's tough nut to crack. And there's just so many complexities that go into it.
And we'll come back to this complexity, especially around the relevance of digital fashion in relation to physical fashion. And the Fabricant has released a sustainability report on this. But Maria, you were talking about the different trends that you're seeing, and maybe you could expound a little more on that and how that is affecting your strategy and how you're approaching both a growth strategy and a sustainability strategy within Google Cloud and the fashion companies that you support.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the past few years have been really interesting to see what trends have changed and how consumer behavior has fundamentally shifted. For the past couple of years, consumers we've seen, they've become much more fickle, much more willing to change brands. We saw that particularly with the pandemic when brands were out of stock. But actually what's been interesting is as we've transitioned to this new normal, consumers increasingly remain fickle. So McKinsey just recently released a study that between 30 to 40% of individuals are still switching brands. So I think this idea of being less brand loyal is something that we're continuing to see. So brands need to think differently about how they actually are engaging potential customers and clients. There's also, I think, been a really fundamental value shift in terms of how consumers perceive brands more widely and how they want to engage with them. And there's two key things that we've seen at Google. One is been a shift to local communities that again started during the pandemic, but it's absolutely continued. We saw in the summer of 2020 that we saw an increase of 20,000% of people searching for local searches. And research has come out across the past few months. This idea of supporting local has become ingrained, I would say, and we expect that to continue. Secondly, what's been really interesting is that individuals are starting to feel like their individual actions can make a huge difference, particularly in terms of sustainability. So there was a recent survey by BCG stating that nearly 95% of the survey group said that they believe their personal actions could help reduce unsustainable waste, tackle climate change. And I think that's really inspiring because that also empowers people and kind of brings us all together. So I think that those are some big things that we're seeing. Lastly, we often talk about with our clients value. What does value mean of a brand? And often it's not the value of a product. No, I think today when consumers and brands talk about value, they're not just talking about the value of a product, which is assumed to be implicit, but they're talking about what a brand stands for. And I think that's coming from people really care. They want to engage more with brands. They want to know more. And I think that's been another fundamental shift that we're seeing throughout the industry.
Thank you, Maria. And I think you bring some important points on building collective supports. And we're not going to be able to do this in silos. We talked about collaboration, we talked about partnership, and Carrie, you were echoing Maria's words. So clearly, we want to be going in the same direction if we're going to achieve this. Now, Carrie, I want to ask you this based off of some of the stats that Maria has shared on the fact that even at an individual level, we're seeing this shift where the customer believes, look, I'm in the driver's seat. I can make this decision. What does that mean on a strategic level for fashion brands? So we see that pledge making, target setting has generally been the traditional approach to this. But how can brands make this more measurable? Maria was talking about value and customers perceive value of the brand and so on. And I'll ask you both this, but Carrie, from your perspective, how do we make this more measurable?
Cool. Well, great question. I'm probably the worst person to ask that, simply because I'm not from the fashion industry. I don't work for fashion brands, and have I never worked for a fashion brand, and I will never work for fashion brands. But I interact with them all the time. I see the challenges that they have and the measurables that they need to put into place. So I'm not going to answer your question, but I'm going to answer it from my perspective of like, exactly. what are the things that, like that are KPIs for the fabricants? How do we measure our success? Well, there's not so many because we don't truly know who our consumer is. I get this question all the time. I'm raising investment right now, and all the VCs are like, well, who's buying your digital fashion? And I'm just like, blockchain people. And it's just like, who are these blockchain people? Because they're anonymous people. So it's very hard to know who our target audience is right now. Now with gaming companies, it's a little bit easier because the gaming companies have their analytics and they know exactly who's playing their games. They know the exact profiles. So anybody playing games such as Star Atlas, which is one of the biggest upcoming games right now. Anybody playing games like Sandbox. Anybody playing the Epic Games ecosystem games. Those are all of our target audience. And basically, the only way for us to measure success is seeing how much our revenue is growing month by month, simply from this NFT drops that we're doing. We're simply just selling clothing on the blockchain right now, and it's just like everything is just a wild guess because it's a wild west and it's a gold rush, and everybody's in this gold rush of trying to figure out what does digital fashion mean for the future. And there's a lot of weird stuff happening the whole time. but at the same time, it's moving forward, and our growth is like 400% every single year, and it's like going faster and faster the whole time. So I totally know that doesn't answer your question, but that's my answer for you right now. So
I'll switch back to you, Maria, because you do have a background in fashion and now working in technology as well. From your perspective, if we're looking at progress over perfection, what is that strategy that fashion companies can employ beyond the target setting and beyond the pledge making?
Yeah, I mean, I think two things. Great question. And Carrie, I learned a lot. So that's super fascinating to hear kind of your approaches. I think in terms of, well, first of all, I think target setting is really, really important. And I think why is it important? And people talk a lot about, well, their targets and how are we tracking, and people, might not say we haven't gotten there yet. Well, I think it is really important to have a clear goal in mind that's time bound and that's specific. And I think it's been inspiring to see how the industry, whether it's the UN Fashion Charter has said that we're going to try to be net emission neutral by 2050. That's great. Clear goal in mind, clear target, but also enough flexibility for brands, which we know have very different operating models, to figure out how they achieve that goal individually. I think to your question about what else can you do other than targets, in addition to reporting and ensuring progress and sharing back, I think it's actually more of like a mentality shift. So I think what brands can do, quite frankly, is set ambitious goals, start with a mentality of what if, be a bit audacious, as opposed to kind of looking at incremental progress and getting scared of making mistakes. I think that's what holds brands back, and all of us back from an individual level, whether you're talking about fashion or other things. Essentially, if you're audacious and you're not afraid to fail and you kind of experiment, and some things will work out and some things won't. And I think that's the only way, from an individual point of view, but also absolutely from a sustainability point of view, that we can see progress. And that's why I believe so much in this idea of progress versus perfection.
Thank you, Maria. I think you raise an important point when you talk about being audacious and being afraid to fail, because I think in the narrative we talk about we cannot afford to fail, right? We have all of these reports. And Carrie, from your perspective, what are the most critical changes as we close out this conversation and get some questions for you? What are the most critical changes that we have to make to face the future effectively, bringing into the conversation this divergent thinking and technology and so on? What are those changes that we must make in developing our strategies?
yeah, it's a big question, and there's a lot of components to it. And typically where the conversation goes towards, okay, changing consumer mindset, or do brands just completely need to change the way that they operate? But what I know from any fashion brand, even some of the biggest names, is they're all operating on tiny margins. They're all kind of in this mentality of like, are we going to survive, the next few collections? Are we going to survive the next few months? And if it's so vulnerable for every single brand, is that they're in constant survival mode, you're not going to be able to innovate internally. Some brands definitely can, but most of them can't. Now, when we talk about the brands who are, have enough money for the next 500 years, regardless of what they do, especially from the luxury fashion industry, what I see the biggest challenge being there is, again, mindset, and just like sticking to doing the things the way that things have always worked. And really, to Maria's point, it's like you need to change the attitude within the organization and not be afraid to fail. But a lot of fashion brands, especially the mid-management people, are so scared of losing their jobs, so scared of doing something wrong that will cost their jobs. So it's the culture that's been created by the traditional fashion industry that's causing fear, that's causing people to really think in short term rather than long term. And a lot of people do have long term possibilities. I talk to a lot of the CSR people from different luxury fashion companies, but they don't have power. They can come in and they can present anything to their senior management and be like, this would be a great solution for a brand. But does it actually happen? Do those things get actually moved? I haven't seen it yet. I have not experienced it. I'm sure it happens to a certain level, but I feel like the CSR departments are almost as useless for some of these brands. You know, it's great people, super passionate, innovative, and I always hear the same story. Yeah, it's just like, I'm just doing this because because I have to. And probably nothing's gonna happen. So that's why for us, I think that, like you call it divergent thinking, which is just do things differently how they used to being done. It's very hard in an existing structure, in an existing power system. That's why I feel like it's really refreshing for the Fabricant to operate, because we operate in our own planet, like we live in our own bubble. It's really easy for us to just kind of like wave goodbye to the traditional fashion industry and be like, hey, we're just going to do our own thing. We're going to figure it out. We're going to create the new fashion industry, the new world, the metaverse fashion, essentially, and operate there. But we want to bring the brands with us, but that's very, very difficult. So I think divergent thinking, I love that term. I think that's super powerful. My question is, how do you execute it when you're working for a very big traditional fashion brand? I don't have an answer.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you. And Maria, perhaps your last thoughts on just that one way. We cannot do away with traditional fashion. We could collaborate, but what is that one way that we can make a substantial difference? We're talking about thriving today in favor of tomorrow. What's that one way? If you were leaving anybody with a final thought on this, what would that be?
Yeah, and I guess I'm a bit more optimistic. I think that a lot of big companies are also thinking about this as well. And how do they do that? I think the CSR departments are quite important and influencing throughout the org, which is inspiring. I think one thing they can do, to Carrie, which I agree what you said, is long-term thinking, taking the big picture, being audacious and saying, what if? I think that's how you make progress. And then just starting, like whatever you do, it's not going to be perfect, but just start.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you, Carrie. I think what we've got from this conversation, when we're talking about divergent thinking on a more granular level, is changing the culture within our organizations, especially in our larger organizations as you're building out your strategy. It is ensuring that you're listening to the customer, some of the data that you shared, Maria, and the fact that the individual is waking up to the fact that they're a part of this journey. And finally, being audacious in our strategy and knowing that it is okay to fail. It is okay to take those small steps. And as we're seeing between digital fashion and physical fashion, that we are partnering together. I just want to thank everybody for being a part of our conversation here today. I want to thank you both, Maria and Carrie, for lending your expertise and your voice, and enjoy the rest of the summit, everybody.
Thank you so much.